Oliver Burkeman, welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us here in the Netherlands. So, to start off with your school of thought, in your own words, what would you say is the gist of your message to humanity?
To humanity?
Yeah.
I guess it is ultimately the idea that I've been sort of chasing down, I guess, for a while now, is that embracing and acknowledging and embracing our human limitations and our finite time and our finite control over life is actually a really sort of powerful thing. It's not something to be avoided or to try to transcend it so that you're limitless and you can do the impossible, but actually to build meaningful lives, to get the important things done. It really helps to kind of turn towards those limitations, almost harness them, maybe you could say.
Right.
Yes, and this is actually your second book, at least the second one that's out in the Netherlands. The first one was 4,000 Weeks, which was a real big bestseller here. And it changed also people's perspective on how much time we have on this planet. So now you have this new book out. Can you tell us a bit about the relationship between the two books?
Sure. I mean, there's definitely a through line, to use that phrase. In that 4,000 Weeks, is all about being finite, what it means to be finite, and how many of our problems with time, distraction, procrastination, all sorts of things, can be understood as coming from an attempt to not confront our limitations, to make ourselves feel limitless when we're not as humans. This new book is about sort of crossing the gap, or I hope it is about crossing the gap from knowing how you'd like to live your life, the work you'd like to do, and how you'd like to show up in your relationships and everything, to kind of actually doing that. Because this has always been my problem, right? You can have all sorts of brilliant ideas about how you want to live, but then you just sort of don't do it and don't do it and don't do it for months and months and years. So I wanted to really get into that idea. And I also wanted, we can talk about this if you like, I also wanted the structure of the book to be something that would be part of that process, of something you would actually do. Because I have read so many sort of self-helpy kinds of books where I think, oh, that's a great idea. You know, in a few months' time, when I finally get some spare time, then I'll put it into practice.
Right.
Never happens. So I wanted to try to counteract that as well.
So this is why you broke it down in, if you will, 28 chunks for 28 days of a short month, if you will.
Yes.
But there's more to it than that, surely. It's not just about reading one chapter a day.
Well, first of all, I can't force anybody to read it at the rate of one chapter a day, right? I mean,
maybe a recommendation.
A big theme of this book is letting go of the attempt to control everything.
Right.
So I can't really try to control how people, read a book that they've bought. It's their book, you know what I mean? But I did want to try to structure it in a way that would help some of these insights and this idea that I call imperfectionism, which we can talk about, to get these insights to kind of get under your skin, right? Instead of being this thing, like I say, that you sort of think about, you think, oh, that's really interesting, I'll put it into practice one day. Instead, it's just like little tiny changes of perspective in the middle of daily life. Because if you need to wait until you've got your email under control and until you've sorted everything out in your life, your relationships, your career, before you do anything to make changes or to live a more enriching life, then you'll be waiting forever, right?
Yeah.
That was the idea of that.
But surely this is one of the many paradoxes that are involved in everything that regards this, because we keep chasing the secret key, the magic bullet to productivity, to efficiency. Yeah, you would also argue it's more of a trap than a solution.
And yet I'm also saying here's 28 days to a new you.
This is my point.
It's a 28-day solution to your problem.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there is I accept that there is an element of what in British idiom we call a bait and switch here, right? You're saying to someone like, here's how to sort your life out, but I'm saying you'll never sort your life out. At least I'm honest and open about this, right? If you read it in the book. I still think it's really useful to take a kind of portion of time, like 28 days, because it's a solid amount of time, but it's not like saying, do this for the next year or something, which is far too long and nobody's ever going to do it. The idea is that over the course of that time, if you sort of understand what I'm trying to argue here, you will have given up, in some sense, on the attempt to sort your life out, but you might also have started more fully living and doing the things that you were waiting to do until you'd sorted your life out. So, there's an element of paradox there, but there's an element of paradox in all this material, right? You can't actually get away from these paradoxes. The idea that it's through accepting ourselves that we're able to change, through facing up to our limitations that we're able to do the most impressive things that we're capable of. Like, this kind of paradox is not getting rid of it.
Yeah.
So, sorry about that.
No, but I'd like to challenge here before we move into the stuff you've just mentioned, because here's this big sell of the last couple of years that's still happening. It's called the AI age to some people. Yeah. And that the promise of AI, and it leads to increased productivity according to those who sell it. Yeah. I'm neutral on whether it delivers or not. For some it may, like Hans. For some it may not. Be your own judge. What's your view on that? Because we're in this age where it's expected to have this productivity, to grab this tool called AI to reach it. Yep. How do you think we should handle that all?
I mean, there's a couple of pieces to this, but I think the one that is most relevant here, there's a general rule, I think, which is a challenge to the whole of kind of optimization culture and efficiency culture, right? Which is that the more efficient you make yourself, the more capable you are to do more and more stuff in the same amount of time, then the more inputs come into the system and the more demands are made on you. So the classic case that I wrote about in my last book, right? If you get really good at answering email quickly, the main effect is you get loads more email.
Mm. And I love that one.
This pattern repeats itself in all areas of personal life, the economy, everywhere, right? That freed up bandwidth, new spare capacity gets filled. So when I hear people say one version of the AI promise, right, which is that AI assistants will handle all the stuff that we don't want to do and leave us free to do the things that only we can do, I think, well, yes, I think there's some truth in that, but it's not going to lead to calm and peace and serenity, because the number of things that you will feel pressured to do that only you can do will increase and increase and increase. There's another side to this, which is kind of to do with the idea that AI can sort of fully replace all sorts of these kind of human tasks and human acts of connection through writing. Obviously, writing is the classic one. Everyone's talking right now about all the ways in which writing and analysis and research and journalism is going to be sort of wiped out the human activity. And there I sort of want to come back to the idea I'm trying to promote in these books, which is, well, even if it's possible on some level, it's not the path to a meaningful existence, because actually, like, connection between humans is ultimately why we're doing almost everything we're doing. If you take all that out so that the AIs can deal with each other to the end of time, that may be what ends up happening, but it won't be a happy situation for a sort of a rich life, I would say.
Yes. If we look at productivity, I mean, you have a very original idea and view on productivity, where others, tend to make us more effective and more performance-oriented and more in less time. And there's an underlying idea that we should have things under control, right? And you have a different opinion about that. Can you explain a bit more about it?
Yeah, I think this idea of control is really central, because I think that when you look at an awful lot of what we do to try to get a handle on our lives, and an awful lot of what we're encouraged to do by a lot of conventional productivity advice, it isn't really necessarily about doing more things or even doing more of the right things. It's about feeling more secure and in control. And I think that misleads us a lot, because ultimately that quest to get into control is a quest to sort of escape the human condition, right? It's a quest to feel more in control than humans actually get to be.
Because we're inherently flawed.
Because we can only know so much, because we can only do so much, because in the end, in any battle that we fight against time is going to win, right? At the very end of the day. So we sort of feel like we want to get out and on top of life, but we're actually in life, like right in it. And I think that quest for control, I mean, part of what I really want to emphasize here, it not only sort of makes us miserable and stressed and anxious, but it's not even the right way to get more of the most important things done, right? So I think again and again you see, I've certainly experienced this personally, when you're really in that control frame of mind, that mindset, very often you actually put things off. You don't do the things that you could do now because you want to feel completely ready. You want to feel like you have all the expertise you require, or the right systems, or the right level of security to act. Very often you sort of hold back from expressing yourself or speaking your mind or something like this because it's like, it's not time yet. First of all, you've got to get in control. So I am against control in that sense, but in the service of an ambitious life, right? I think that it would be wrong to suggest that this is about kind of settling for mediocre goals and just saying, well, you can't do everything, so why bother? No, it's precisely by sort of letting go of that urge for control, which I still struggle with totally, by the way. I mean, of course, right? But the more that you can do that, the more that you can like fully live and act in the present.
Yeah. Now, there's one side to productivity. There's another to perfectionism, which you've already mentioned as well. Would you still, as you just mentioned, would you still consider yourself to be a perfectionist?
Well, I think this idea of being, this idea that's borrowed from elsewhere about being a sort of in recovery, for being a recovering perfectionist is useful, right? I don't think that that tendency in me will ever go completely away, but I've sort of seen through it in a way, right? So it's easier and easier for me to not be completely dictated to by those parts of my personality.
You can live with that version of yourself,
right? And you can sort of say, okay, yeah, that's that old desire for control and perfection, or for making sure everyone's happy, or for and it's okay, it's there, but it's not going to dictate all my actions. And this is important actually, because it is quite possible to be perfectionistic about wanting to get rid of your perfectionism, right? It's quite possible to take this attitude towards personal transformation that says, like, everything must change. From now on, I'm a completely different person. I'm going to, work this very, very structured way. I've got this perfect morning routine that I found on YouTube. And
wake up at 5 a.m.
Right now, I'm going to copy it. Yeah, exactly. And again, I argue that because what's really going on there is wanting to feel in control, that's actually a bad way to make real substantive change in your life, because it's actually not motivated by wanting to do something different. It's motivated by wanting to feel like you're dominating life, really.
You have one great artifact of that. You are not that much in favor of to-do lists, but more in favor of done lists, right? Is that a
yeah? Sorry.
Is that a way that it shows off that you actually look at what you've actually achieved instead of what you still have to do?
I think this is really important. I'm not against to-do lists, right? I have that myself, but I think if you're going to have a to-do list, you should have a done list, because otherwise we have this tendency, very understandable tendency, but to compare what we are, what we have done or what we're doing to the complete universe of things that could usefully be done. And that is essentially infinite, always. So the comparison is always very, very bad. And for many of us, there's this sort of moral layer to it. It's like you beat yourself up because you still haven't done all the things, even though doing all the things would be impossible, right? Because it's an infinite supply. So when you make an effort, very simple kind of technique, right? To just keep a list through the day that gets longer the more that you do, just writing down the things that you have done. It's just useful for sort of shifting the focus, comparing your output to zero instead of to infinity, right? Because if you compare yourself to infinity, it's never going to work out well. And actually, people who do this, they find it leads to this very interesting effect where you start to think very carefully about, okay, well, what am I going to take from the universe of possibilities and move it onto my done list by doing it? So you make slightly better choices, not because you've got some whole scheme about these are my visions and my goals and my weekly goals and my daily goals but just because it's like, okay, time is limited. I'm the bottleneck. What am I going to take and pass through this bottleneck? So you start to sort of focus more on things you care about and less on busy work.
Yeah. I'm going to have a conversation with my wife because the other day she won an argument about having a done list rather than just my to-do list. So thank you for that, Oliver. That does lead me to a bit of a left field question, though. Would you say there's a correlation between self-conscious and one's self-image correlated with level of education and social class?
Say a bit more about that. I think probably the answer is going to be yes, but yes, say a bit more.
I know a lot of people who are also slightly more higher educated, who are eager to be productive, who need to be productive, who may have troubles with their self-image and maybe a perfectionist or not. How is that correlated with social class according to your research?
That's a really interesting question, and I think that there's this idea that you get that comes up again and again in this area that how bad you feel about falling short of perfection is correlated to how broad your horizons are, how much sort of ambition for your life has been inculcated in you. So clearly, something that more privileged people, more educated people get is a cultural message that you can do what you want to do with your life. And maybe people at less fortunate social classes, sort of the ideology that is absorbed is less ambitious to begin with. And it's also a similar idea that comes with technology, right? As technology enables us to get closer and closer to doing everything, but never to the success of doing everything, that also becomes more tormenting. So it's an interesting point. Obviously, there's many, many advantages to being at a sort of a middle or an upper middle class situation in life. But the more that you think, I'm free to fulfill all my potential, then the more tormenting it is to realize that just because you're human, there's going to be a big limit to how much you can do. I think that's a really interesting angle, actually.
Yeah, and it ends up all being rather existential from that point on.
The whole thing is existential, right? Because on some level, it's all about this notion that we have to sort of, not just that we want to do a lot of stuff, that's great, make a difference in the world, make some money, this is all fantastic, but that we sort of need to somehow justify our existence through our productivity, which is an idea with, old religious roots. Some of those roots, at least partly in this part of the world, right? Some of those Protestant ideas, but also very reinforced by our modern cultural and economic system, right? That actually you haven't quite earned the right to exist for another day unless you've done a certain amount of stuff. Yeah.
Right. I think we've arrived at the structure of your book by now, because I'd argue, having the book divided in 28 chapters of each day for a short month, thus 4 sections correlating with the weeks. Let's mention them as we go along. And the first one is accepting finitude. You start with a hard truth, which is it's worse than you think. Why is this liberating? Because if I tell my wife it's worse than you think, she'll kill me.
Metaphorically.
Yes. Well, hopefully.
Okay, let's go.
I mean, this idea, this is sort of central to me and what has meant so much to me about this kind of, these ideas, right? There's a sense in which what we need to hear in order to sort of be a bit more liberated and empowered to do what we want to do with our lives, what we need to hear is that things are, as you say, worse than we thought they were. Because, one example here is, if you think that getting on top of all your to-dos, getting on top of all your emails, if you think that's really, really difficult, then that makes your life into a constant, permanent, agonizing slog.
Yes.
To try to get to that place. You never get there. You're always dissatisfied.
You're in the treadmill.
Right, exactly. If you see that actually it's worse than that it's not really, really difficult to get on top of everything, but it's actually impossible to get on top of everything because that would mean being infinite instead of being a finite human, there's an immediate kind of relaxation, right? It's like, oh, well, okay. If I'm never going to win that fight, I don't need to fight that fight. I can focus my time and energy and attention on doing a few of the things that I really want to do and that make me feel the most alive and all the rest of it. And you find this pattern repeating again and again, right? So it's not just to do with being too busy, but imposter syndrome is another familiar one. People think it's going to be so hard to get to the point where I feel ready to take bold action. But then if they see that oh, I'm never going to get to the state where I feel ready to take bold action. Might as well take the bold action today, right? So it really is sort of directly freeing, I think, in that respect, because what we're doing most of the time is trying to get outside of our basic situation. And what I mean by it's worse than you think is like, you're never going to get outside of that. And this is an idea that crops up again and again, especially in sort of Zen Buddhist tradition, where you find people saying, you know, your problem is thinking that there's like some way out, some way of solving being human. That's the problem. Not that you haven't found the solution to it yet, but that you think there ought to be a solution. So I quote in the book, and again everywhere, because it means so much to me, but like this line from a British Zen master, G.U. Kennett, which is in the book, where she said that her method of teaching students was not to try to make the burden of the student lighter, but to make it so heavy that he or she would put it down. Yeah. I love that idea, right? That idea of like, oh, when you see what a ridiculous situation we're in as human beings, you can be like, okay, that's the situation. So now what shall we do? Yeah. I find that really inspiring myself.
Yeah, you had also this great metaphor with books, right? If there's a few books you should still read, that feels like uncomfortable. Where if you're in the British Library, you know you'll never be able to read all the books.
Yeah.
So it feels quite okay that you have that feeling that, I mean, these are not all the books for me to read.
Right. We put these strange boundaries around things like, you know, if I've been recommended a book, then I really need to get through that list. Or if it's sitting on my bedside table, then I should get through it. And people in an older generation, you often find they think that like if there's a magazine or a newspaper in their house, they're obliged to like read it, which I think is silly. But then I do exactly the same thing with my queue in my note-taking app, right, of articles to read later. But that's just arbitrary, as you say. Nobody is troubled, very few people are troubled by the fact that we're not going to read all the books in the British Library, the Library of Congress, you know, million upon million of titles. We just have to pick a few in the time that we have.
Yeah. Now, on one hand, we can consider this a comforting and liberating thought. But I'm going to play the devil's advocate a bit here. Because you just mentioned the word imposter syndrome, which resonates strongly with a lot of people, surely. But you could also argue that effectively with this, you're proclaiming a maybe benign coping mechanism for those kinds of people. Or I would rephrase that as asking you, how should your readers and listeners prevent interpreting this as a way of cutting themselves too much slack and still getting their arses into gear, if you will?
Well, sometimes I feel like the right response to this kind of question is to say, this is one of those problems that you can deal with if it ever arises. You know, it's like people say, I think that so many of us are in this category that psychologists call insecure overachievers, right? We're so sort of driven, but driven in a kind of anxious, rather neurotic way. We might fear that if we give ourselves a little grace and kindness, we're instantly going to become totally, inert and useless. I don't think there's any real chance of that for anyone for whom these issues feel alive. There are people who spend too much of their lives just sitting on the couch watching, Netflix or whatever. But they're not going to be concerned with this stuff in the first place, right? They're not worried about it in the same way.
They won't listen to the podcast either.
Right.
It's too much trouble.
Yeah. I'm gonna take a guess that your audience is more likely to be a little bit too driven, a little bit too ready for action, perfectionistic, than like really need a kick in the backside to do something meaningful in life, right? So that's who I'm writing for.
Go on.
I do think that it's not the only response to the point. I think the other point I really want to make about that is like it's a misunderstanding, I would say, of this idea, which is of course not my idea originally, right? It goes all the way back through lots of philosophy and psychology. It's a misunderstanding of this idea that to suggest that if you let go of control at least a little bit, what takes over is just your worst possible instincts for laziness and sort of uselessness. What takes over is the fact that pretty much all of us on some level would quite like to have a life that feels like effective and like we're doing something that matters and we're bringing something into the world that counts and that might be remembered a little bit, or making a difference to people. Like you have to have a certain level of trust in yourself that when you ease up on all the sort of internal taskmaster business, the person underneath that is not some kind of awful layabout.
Yes, yeah. Great. Yeah, so I think we can go to week 2, right?
Yes.
Where we have a very interesting take on the distribution of time between thinking about something and actually making a first step.
Taking action.
Taking action. So you say one of the things you say in your book is that we have to make a choice, which is better than keep on overthinking it. Can you explain a bit about that, and also let us know how we can do that?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think this is really interesting. I think you could argue that sort of deciding, the act of deciding, is maybe the archetypal, the epitome of what we're talking about here, right? Because to decide is automatically to kind of acknowledge your limitations, the fact that you can't go in every direction endlessly into the future. You have to make decisions.
You're committing to something.
Yes, exactly. But I think one of the sort of shifts that was really powerful for me was I think generally we tend to think about decisions as things that come to us, like we're sitting here and then going through life, and then there's a decision. Oh, okay. Do I take this job offer? Do I ask this person to start a relationship? Whatever, But actually, what I've found myself is that it's almost more powerful to think about decisions as things that you go looking for. So you sort of, if you're stuck in your work, your life, or some project, whatever it is, you sort of ask yourself, what is some decision that I could take here? And this is important. It can be tiny, right? It has to be a real decision in the sense of one path and not the other paths. But it doesn't need to be a grand gesture, like quitting your job or, deciding to spend weeks and weeks and weeks on some project that is so dear to your heart, right? It could be something as simple as you want to write a screenplay, you've got like 3 or 4 vague ideas for how it should begin, choose one, write it down, go on to the next step. You want to launch something that involves a website, choose the platform that you're going to do this on, sign up to it. Obviously, it's not a completely permanent commitment. Almost nothing is a permanent commitment, but it is nonetheless a sort of it's done in the spirit of saying, I can't do all these things, so instead of hanging around, making myself feel like I've got all the options and my options are all open, I'm going to just choose one and go for it. And what you find is that if you can get into the habit of taking those real decisions, however tiny they are, you kind of don't necessarily ever have to make those kind of terrifying grand gestures where you quit a job in a sudden way or do something like that because you're sort of carried forward by the act of taking decisions.
Yeah, but actually undertaking that act, whether it's not reading that one article or saying I'm not going to respond to 100 emails today because I need to prioritize something else, that is ultimately largely determined by our work or even by our home situation. It can be my wife asking for the millionth time to clean out the attic.
Wife is getting a very big role in this podcast, Joe.
I love her making a mistake.
He needs to be here and have a say for herself.
I'm trying to paraphrase thoughts that our listeners will have as well.
Asking for a friend, yes.
Yes, but ultimately, surely you agree with me, Oliver, a large part of our mental load is fueled by pressure. Relentless pressure, infinite quest for productivity, capitalist world, or just whatever needs to get done in your house. How do you escape that while prioritizing the values?
Well, see, I don't think you escape it. I think
deal with it.
I think you grapple with it in a different way, and this is relevant to a chapter in the book about the idea of freedom and consequences. Each of these chapters begins with a quote from somebody else, which I then sort of talk about. And the quote in the chapter I'm talking about is from an American therapist, Sheldon Kopp, who said, "You're free to do whatever you like. You need only face the consequences," which is an incredibly sort of interesting idea to me. So I think it can be really useful in the context of the kind of pressure that you're talking about to see that really all we're ever doing in life when we face that kind of pressure is sort of deciding which set of negative consequences we want to incur. So if you spend an extra hour at the office answering emails, then various people who are emailing you won't get impatient, but the downside is you won't get to spend time with your family. If you go and spend time with your family, the downside is that people will get impatient because you didn't answer the emails. Now, the right course of action could be very different for a different person. There are definitely times, I mean, I sort of made that one sound like, of course, you want to spend time with your family and not answer emails, but maybe you have to answer the emails if you want to keep your job. Maybe there are parts of the project that you're working on that are so important that it's the right trade-off to make. But it's just that idea of thinking in trade-offs, right? It's the idea of saying, it's not that I have to do all the things I feel pressured to do. That makes no sense, because you could easily be, we're all pressured to do more things than we possibly could do. It's not that I have to make sure everyone around me is happy and pleased with what I'm doing. It's that is one priority. And, you know, spending time with my family or getting to go and play tennis or getting to do whatever else. These are all different priorities, and all I'm doing is weighing them. It's still hard to weigh them, but it's incredible how readily we don't even get to that stage, right? We just think to ourselves, oh, it's absolutely essential that I keep everybody happy all the time because of some aspect of how I was raised as a child. So now I've just got to make sure that nobody's cross with me because I haven't answered an email. And as a result, you fail to see that all you're doing is sort of weighing negative consequences. So it's really empowering, for me anyway, to understand that, like, you're always just choosing, like, which problem would you like to have?
Yes. Have we moved into week 3 now?
We can. I think that was actually back to week 1 for a moment, but never mind.
It's but in week 3 you're talking about letting go, about letting go of the illusion of control, and also shifting your priorities and your way of thinking about it. What is the general theme in week 3 for the readers of the book and the listeners of the podcast?
Yeah, I really wanted to emphasize here, because this is something I have definitely struggled with perhaps more than the rest of it, is that taking action on what matters is only partly a matter of sort of making things happen, and it is to a very significant extent a matter of letting things happen. That is to say, a lot of what gets in our way is not an absence of motivation, but all these kind of psychological barriers that we throw up. So, you know, one part of that is just this now quite famous idea that crops up in the work of Tim Ferriss and Elizabeth Gilbert and a number of other people, that sometimes you actually need the guts to ask, what if something you're doing, what if this were easy, right? What if I sort of broke that connection in my mind between the idea that something really matters and the idea that it must be incredibly hard and exhausting and unpleasant? And then you often see that you're bringing that to the situation. You've decided, for all sorts of old reasons, you know, that would come out in therapy. We can go into them here or not. But you've decided that you're not really doing the right kind of thing unless it's painful in some way, which is completely ridiculous. You know, I think life has enough pain in it without adding this whole extra layer. So that's one example. That's one chapter within that week, but of how actually the problem is something we put in the way of action. It isn't always that we need to sort of, you know, shove ourselves forward into action. Action can very often happen naturally once we're not obstructing it.
Yes, we have a question from Ben Tikkelaar, who's actually who writes columns for a big Dutch newspaper, and he did one on your book. And I also asked him, "Do you have a question for our guest?" Yes, and he said, you know, and I think this is something that relates to a lot of listeners. When you say you have to make clear decisions, you also have to decide on things you will no longer do. Mm-hmm. And we would like to know, do you have a personal example of something that you decided to not do any longer? And how did you make that happen? Because you cannot just say, you know, I won't do this anymore. You will have to deal with the consequences. Can you tell us an example on how, and also give us a bit of hindsight and ideas on the process that you went through?
Something that was not easy to cut out of your life.
Right. That's a good point. I can try. I mean, I do think that, just as a sort of general preliminary, I don't think that it is easy to stop doing anything. I think that, especially if it feels like something you really, that gratifying to do, so you end up sort of, you fall off the wagon, you get back on, you fall off the wagon, you get back on. I mean, if I'm going to speak really honestly, it's very obvious and a little bit cliched, but I think that the general question of trying to sort of step back from being completely social media addicted is something that I've definitely pretty much found a better way to be with. Again, it's a very, very common problem, so it feels a little unremarkable to talk about it.
But it's also relatable.
It's relatable, and it's absolutely true, right? And I think that, one thing that absolutely did not work in that regard was just sort of deciding that through a very large amount of willpower, I was going to make myself not spend hours scrolling, making myself furious at people's stupid opinions, and why wouldn't they listen to me instead? A big part of what has made a difference in that regard, well, I'd say two things. Firstly, it's a question of sort of replacing it with something, right? So you have to sort of push it out of your attention rather than just decide not to put your attention there. So the more that I am able, and it is incremental, it's not easy at first, but the more that I'm able to say, well, okay, I feel that desire, so I'm going to read 10 more pages of this book I'm really into reading. And 10 pages is a good sort of gamification thing, right? Yeah. It feels like, I'm not just going to say, oh, you should read instead of being on social media. It's like, no, I'm going to try and achieve something. 10 pages. It's a silly trick, but I find that it that kind of thing can really help you sort of gradually shift from the activity you don't want to be doing to the activity that you do want to be doing. But the other part of it was just, I know I'm always saying it's the perspective shift. It's not a technique. It's not a trick. But I'm afraid that I think that is true. I think that's how change happens. And for me, a big part of that with distraction was seeing what was going on when I was giving into distraction in that way, which is that, I was encountering something in whatever I was doing that challenged my desire for control. I was either feeling unsure about whether I could write the next paragraph well, or I was feeling frustrated that I couldn't determine the pace at which the train moved, or I was feeling frustrated because I was spending sort of hours and hours of the day looking after a toddler, which is in certain moments absolutely wonderful, and then for long periods you just have to be there. You have no control over that situation. And I think that is why you see all the parents at the playground checking their phones, because it's an escape from facing the limitations of the situation.
I can so much relate.
So, what I'm trying to do in this book, when I talk about sort of dripping this perspective change in a gradual way so that it actually takes root, I think that's how change happens, right? Because I could say, follow this 6-step protocol for no longer being on social media all day. And if you're anything like me, you'll be like, yeah, great, I'm going to do it. And you either don't do it for 6 months, or you do it for a day or two. And then it's like, I don't have the reserves of willpower left to keep sort of replenishing this day after day. Whereas the moment you see what's going on, that can be really powerful, and that can sort of last a lot longer. So
while we're on the topic of the process of letting go, and you've just now greatly described, getting rid of some habits you like to lose, but looking at stuff you'd like to get done or to achieve, like getting all your files organized, setting up your portfolio, managing that job promotion. Yeah, there's ambition there. And what would you say is the way to channel that without pressuring yourself too much to still reach for that goal and getting there, while managing perfectionism, imposter syndrome, but still getting there?
It's a great question. And I think that one of the things that I write about and have noticed in myself for a good while is that a certain approach to ambitious accomplishment, as we've been hinting at already, right, actually has the opposite effect. So if you set out to say, okay, this really matters, here's my plan, here's what I'm going to do with every single hour of the day for the next 3 months, very quickly that kind of projecting forward into the future ends up serving as a kind of avoidance. It ends up serving as a way of not doing things because you're sort of putting yourself into endless preparation mode. And so the thing I'm emphasizing again and again is like, just do the thing for 10 minutes today, right? That is a superpower.
The golden minimum.
Right. Yes. Right. If you can just bring yourself to actually do a bit of the writing, to actually pick up the phone and talk to the person, then to sort of actually go to the, whatever it is, that is the thing that's going to make the difference. So it's this sort of, it's a very incremental approach. It's very much an approach of like, repeatedly asking yourself, what shall I do next? What shall I do next? What shall I do next? Which can feel sort of almost too gentle. But it isn't too gentle because the crucial thing is you're actually doing the thing. So listen, if you want a productivity hack answer to this question, the sort of ultimate productivity hack, I think, so ridiculously basic that that people laugh at it, but it really works, is you take a notebook or a file on your phone, whatever. You take a notebook, top line of the notebook, you write, first page, you write one thing that you feel that needs doing, that you want to do, that you're willing to do. And you do that thing and you cross it out. And then you write a new thing on the second line and you do that thing and you cross it out.
One by one.
One by one, sequentially. And each time you're asking, like, what feels like it needs doing? Like, what is life asking?
You mean you just let it fall into your head without overthinking it on beforehand?
Absolutely. And it doesn't mean you can't also have a
long to-do list,
schedule and a plan and a goal for the quarter. Or I'm not saying throw those things out. I'm just saying what it really comes down to over and over again is just like, the very next moment and the very next moment and the very next moment. And a lot of the time, all our efforts to do something more impressive than that are actually ways to just sort of avoid having to do the thing. So you say, like, I'd like to meditate regularly. I'd like to become the kind of person who does that all the time. So you go buy the books and you sign up for the course and you get the right cushions and just sit down, 10 minutes, badly. Look it up on the internet. There's like, you can read about how to meditate in 30 seconds. That actually requires more kind of courage and guts, I would say, than the whole supposedly ambitious, like life-changing mindset.
Yes. You already struck a bit on meditation. Your book actually in English is called Meditation for Mortals, and in Dutch is called The 4-Week Reset. So there is it looks more like a productivity book in the Netherlands.
A localization shift.
A localization shift. But the 4th week is about being present, which is also a very core element of meditation. You state that we often tend to neglect our future selves. Can you tell us a bit more?
Well, what I actually claim is that we give too much attention in certain ways to our future selves, and I think that it's I think this is a very interesting question as relates to sort of the modern emphases in productivity culture and all the rest of it, right? I mean, it's true that there are people who don't give enough attention to their future selves, right? They spend money indiscriminately on momentary, impulsive things, and then it turns out that that's really bad deal for future them. But again, the kind of people who are interested in this stuff, and probably in your audience, I think we have a much greater risk of being too good at deferring gratification, being too good at living for our future selves. This is a big emphasis in a lot of kind of productivity literature now, is like, be kind to your future self, do all this now, like think about what your future self will thank you for. And you can sort of overinvest in that very easily, so that everything you do in your present moments of your actual life on the planet, becomes this kind of strategy for making the future you happy or fulfilled. And you sort of never get there, right? Because when you get to the future, you're looking to a new future beyond that. So the famous marshmallow experiments that talk about how great it is to be able to resist one marshmallow and wait among children and wait for the promise of a second marshmallow. And what I'm saying in the book is like, that's true, but like also you don't just want to acquire as many marshmallows as you can in your life, right? At some point you have to eat a marshmallow, because that's how you enter into life and enjoy life. So I think actually for a lot of us, we need to think about sort of easing up a little bit on a focus on future self. Not abandoning it, because yes, you should put aside money for retirement, and yes, you should think about what you've got to do tomorrow before you have the third cocktail and all of this stuff, of course. But not to see the whole of life as an effort to get to a point in the future where a new version of you will be like, okay, now I'm happy. Now I can relax. Because it's life is too short. Life is too finite.
Yet at the same time, I would add to that it can be a very powerful tool to view yourself as various versions of yourself. Yep. Because I was struggling with mental burnout 6 years ago. My good friend and trained psychologist, Ramiro, shout out, he handed me this thought experiment that was looking at myself as various iterations, as versions. He said, the last version of yourself, pre-burnout, that's Mark 3. This one's Mark 4. Actually, speaking in the current, I'm Mark 5 now. I'm looking at the retirement fund for Mark 10, if you will.
Right.
So how can people harness, looking ahead, looking at the current, maybe looking at the past, to getting there, prioritize, just fall into their head?
Yeah, I think that's you're totally right. I'm not suggesting like abandon thinking about the future. The thing that I think is so important, and this is in the 4th week of the book, is this idea that I've called starting from sanity, but you could call it many different things. I'll try and convey what I mean, and I should say I'm just super impressed at anyone having these conversations in English when it's not their very first language, because I certainly couldn't do it in Dutch.
We put in the effort.
You do. The way in which you live towards those future iterations, those future marks of yourself, it needs to be something that embodies that right now, right? So the distinction I'm making is between the person who says, I want to live a life of ease, and I want to have time to sort of be out in the countryside, and I want to spend time with my family. Therefore, I'm going to go and lock myself in my office for 16 hours a day for the next 3 years to make huge amounts of money so that I can then go and do those things. Versus the kind of person who says that's what I want to be in the future. So I'm going to find some way to express that in my life right now. Maybe only in a small way. Maybe the burdens of other responsibilities are much too great to sort of, just start spending days and days and days wandering the countryside or whatever. Maybe you still have to work long hours. But to find a way to act immediately from that identity that you want to get to. There's a author called Richie Norton who expresses this in this quote in his book, which is called Anti-Time Management, I think is the name of his book. And he says, it's a two-step plan. 1, decide who you want to be. 2, act from that identity immediately. And on some level, that makes it sound a little bit simple and easy, doesn't it? But I think that's the important thing, right? It's not falling into the trap of saying, because I want to be like that in the future, I will live in some completely other self-punishing way
then
now.
The sky will open and then you get there.
Right, because what actually happens almost always when you live in that way is you just reinforce the idea that's how you're going to live, and you reinforce the idea that life is for the future and for the future and for the future until eventually your future runs out.
So ultimately what you're saying is do it now.
Do it now and embody a little bit of how you want your life to be now, right? So it's, do it now. And if something matters to you, find some way for it to be in your life now, as opposed to seeing it as something you're going to get to spend loads and loads of time doing really perfectly in the future.
Oliver, I can't thank you enough for having this inspiring conversation with us. Where can people learn more about your work?
Well, the books are available wherever you get your books. And my website, oliverburkeman.com, has other information, signing up for my newsletter, things like that.
Yes. Well, first of all, now finally, Oliver, we have a few books which are given to us by our publisher. And
signed them well, we should say.
Well. I don't think you have signed them yet, but
no, I happily will.
We'll get this right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and we want to give them to listeners of this podcast who think they really need this stuff. Mm-hmm. So, what could be a good indicator? Because people can send us an email at podcast@denkproducties.nl. Podcast@denkproducties.nl. What would be a good question to filter out the best people to read this book?
That is very, very interesting. Wow. I mean, something that I hear from people quite often is, and it's very flattering when they put it in this way, but they sort of talk as if like, were you inside my head or something? Were you writing it especially for me? And I'm flattered, but my response is always like, no, I just think there are quite a lot of us who are kind of a bit screwed up in the similar fashion. So, I do think that if this stuff resonates, if you feel, if the idea that you are living for a future moment when your life will be sorted out or when you will no longer have problems. I don't know if this is the kind of question you mean, but that's the kind of person that I think is probably going to be most receptive to this. If you're frustrated by the sense that you know what you want to be doing with your life and you don't see an obvious reason why you're not doing it, if you just want a list of the things you're supposed to be doing with your life, then this is I'm not your guy. But it's that kind of thing. I don't know if I phrased that as a question.
No, I think we have a good solution now, because I think people can send us an email with only only 2 words. That's me. And if it's you, then you get the book.
Yes. What's the email address again?
podcast@denkproducties.nl.
Perfect. Well, we're signing off. Dit was DenkTank, de podcast van Denkproducties. Met als speciale gast Oliver Burkeman. Vergeet niet je te abonneren, deze podcast te beoordelen. En vergeet ook niet deze aflevering van DenkTank te delen met je netwerk. Met een vriend of collega waar je aan denkt bijvoorbeeld. Tot de volgende aflevering. Dankjewel Hans, ik vond het fantastisch.
Dankjewel voor het hosten. And thank you Oliver for being here.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Bye bye.
Great, thanks.
Is that what you needed?
Yes, we could have gone on for hours.